Okay. No, I mean, I'm fine if you don't record it too. I don't think the world needs any more recordings of me or any. And so, no, I don't speak Spanish. I can understand. I can understand enough. The last time I was in Latin America, it's always so frustrating because people assume that I can speak Spanish, and then even if you can understand them, but you can respond in English, then they get irritated. Like you're a sellout. Like you have sold out your culture, and it's like, no, 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 that language colonized me. Glad I don't know it. No, I'm kidding. But so we're going to move into Spanish history today. And so there's lots more that we could talk about, especially in terms of the Chamorro-Spanish Wars. It is one of my favorite periods in history to talk about because there's so much that we have found in recent years in random accounts, letters, sort of that adds more interesting things into the story, complicates it a lot more, makes it more fascinating, makes it more dramatic and exciting. But we need to move ahead. And so the Spanish period in Guam history is interesting because it is a very long period. It lasts for several hundred years. But if you look at any Guam history book, the period on the Spanish history is usually one of the shortest sections in it. Despite taking, depending on when you decide to sort of account for it, you could say it's about 230 years, 230 years or so. Depending on if you say that it begins with the Chamorro-Spanish Wars, or subtract 30 if you think that it begins when the Chamorro-Spanish Wars end. But it is a huge period of time. But if you look at, for example, if you look at a book like Destiny's Landfall, the section on World War II, which is 32 months of time, is about as large as the period on the Spanish period, which is 230 years of time. Or even the pre-war American period, which is about 40 years of time. People will often write more about that than the Spanish period. Some of the reasons why this happens is simply because of the narratives that have been created that have been put out there by missionaries, by Spanish government officials, and then by historians, and oftentimes by Chamorros themselves, which sort of minimize and diminish this period of history. That these 200 years, that sort of the Chamorro-Spanish Wars is a time of valiant resistance, defiance to colonialism, and then what happens afterwards is sort of the last gasps of the people as they start to disappear. The once proud race, as a Chamorro before World War II wrote in a poem, sort of that the once proud race of the Chamorro disappears. And so now Spanish officials talk about that, missionaries talk about that, visitors to Guam talk about that, and eventually Chamorros themselves also come to accept that they disappear. And we can see this in a number of different ways that the culture does change. At the same time, though, we can see that the culture, oh wait, here, let me share. Por favor, let me share, because there's a few things that I can share. Is that the culture and the people don't disappear. One of the things that's fascinating about culture is that we often think about culture and we talk about culture as if it is this defined, coherent thing. It's not. You cannot fit any culture, regardless of whether it's been impacted by colonization, in a box. It will always move beyond any one person's box to contain it, any one historian's attempt to define it, any one anthropologist's attempt to demarcate it. And this is true for all cultures. It's not only true for cultures that have experienced trauma via colonization. And so the Chamorro people don't disappear, but like many people that have undergone the trauma that they did, they adapt and they change. And at first their adaptations may be, hold on, here we go. At first, their adaptations maybe them trying to sort of trick the system. But eventually, after several generations, they accept a lot of those things as the norm for them. So when we look at the beginning of this period, we see the impact on the Chamorro people. A huge number of them have died. It's estimated that perhaps 90% of Chamorros die from the occupation by the Spanish, primarily due to diseases. Navigation was a hallmark of Chamorro society, especially for those who lived along the coasts, and navigation is no longer allowed. The Spanish used Chamorro canoes for several generations after the Chamorro-Spanish wars are over, but by the start of the 1800s, the Spanish now use Carolinian canoes from other islanders in Micronesia because Chamorros have forgotten how to make them, because the Spanish prohibited them from making them and from teaching the knowledge, fearing that the Chamorros would use it to their advantage to escape the island. Chamorros no longer make laddie stones or build their houses on top of them. They start to build their houses in just sort of in simple wooden style, often on posts, similar to the style we see in the Philippines. The dances of Chamorros are prohibited, that their Chamorros are no longer allowed to pass them on, no longer allowed to do them in public, and eventually in time Chamorros adopt new dances from the Philippines and from Spain as being their own. Chamorro religion of ancestral worship is also suppressed. Chamorros and their skulls of their ancestors, which was central to how they organized their spirituality, they're no longer allowed to take the skulls of their ancestors. They're definitely not allowed to keep them in their houses, and they're not allowed to publicly pray to them. Instead, they're supposed to pray to saints and to God, and so on. And at first, Chamorros largely accept these things just publicly, but privately they resist these things. And that resistance means that they find ways to adapt these things. And we see this wherever colonization happens, is that it's never something where 100% is lost or 100% is changed, because it's always a negotiation. Because as new ideas come in, as new technology comes in, sometimes it is accepted in a very full sense. Sometimes it's accepted in a limited sense. Sometimes the names will change, but the spirit may stay the same. And so we see that in the ways in which there's continuity. So historians often talk about a break at this time, and they often try to highlight that break by talking about how Chamorros die out. So they say that the men died out and the women all married. And that's why sort of these changes happen. And that's why Chamorro culture gets lost. And that's why there's no real Chamorros anymore. But when we look at the history of this time, we see that actually a lot of adaptation takes place, and there is a sense of continuity. And the sense of continuity that Chamorros have is no different than people who used to work in farms and then now have transitioned into cities and then transition into suburbs. The types of changes that take place in lifestyle and culture and habit and language, these are things that happen in all societies. It's just that the stigma of colonization hurts people more, and it becomes a reason for arguing that they don't exist anymore because everything has been taken from them. And so, but here are some examples of how the continuity persists, and that the Chamorro sense of self, that they are distinct and that they do not just become lost as some sort of Spanish mestizo mutts. The gualu becomes the lanzo. The connection to the land persists. It doesn't disappear, it doesn't get replaced. And that's one thing that the Spanish officials actually feel frustrated about, is that the Chamorros still cling to the land. They don't want to use it to sort of make money. They don't want to use it to sell things. The Americans later become even more frustrated with that. Instead, Chamorros see the land as being a strongly connected part of themselves, right? For the most part. The guput, the love of partying, persists, although with a religious veneer to it. The guput becomes the fiesta. This is one way in which the Catholic Church eventually is able to get Chamorros to embrace this new religion, is once they stop making it about kneeling and obeying, kneeling in church and obeying and all of these things which are kind of boring. But once they encourage people, actually, no, your love of life can be put into the church too. The villages can have their huge parties to celebrate your saint. And once that part becomes more prominent, Chamorros are more accepting of the new religion because it connects with something that is inside of them, something that is important to them, the ability to gather, enjoy life, see relatives, compete over who makes the best food, sing together, all sorts of stuff like that. The Aniti becomes the Tautomona. The Aniti, the ancestral spirit, transforms to become the Tautomona. Chamorros still believe that the island is filled with spirits, but instead of feeling like these spirits are their mothers and their fathers, their close relatives, they now see these spirits as being these spirits as being the people from long before, that they are not closely connected to. There still persists a sense of respect. You don't mess with the Tautomona, just as you didn't mess with the Aniti. You sometimes had to apologize to the Tautomona, just as you had to apologize to the Aniti. But there wasn't the same sort of thing like with the Aniti, where as you go about your day, you talk to the spirits of your ancestors. If you're about to do something scary, you talk to them and you ask them for help. You make deals and promises to them. The relationship to the Tautomona was not of the same level of intimacy, but there remained a respect that the Tautomona was something connected to artifacts of the past, to the natural world, and you had to respect their domain. The Makana, who was the spiritual mediator for Chamorros in ancient times with their Aniti, becomes the Surahanu, and what we would call now today the Zoamti. In that the Makana, as sort of the competition of the priests, cannot exist anymore. But people who have that connection to the spiritual realm, they still exist. They go underground. They hide their ability to connect to the spirits of the Chamorro people, the spirits of the land, and they hide it within traditional medicine. So they take on the task of healing people, but they also covertly talk to people about their spirits and help people that have Tautomona and spirit-related problems. And finally, as we talked about in the first class, the Magahaga becomes Santa Maria. The Catholic Church is actually resisted by many Chamorros for a few generations. They go to church because they don't have a choice, but they don't accept the church in their heart because they don't see themselves in the church. But once in the 1700s, there's a change in the priests who run the church in Guam. It begins this process by which more and more Chamorros see their culture and see themselves in the church. And one of them is when Santa Maria is put out more as a symbol of the church as opposed to men, to male figures. And so one of the ways that we can still see this persisting is that Santa Maria Camelan is the patroness for the island. Many people believe that she is the patron saint for Hagatna because that's where her procession, her lukau is, but she's not the patron saint for Hagatna. The patron saint for Hagatna is Ignatius de Loyola Despensadzo, who was the founder of the Jesuit Priests. And so the Jesuits were the ones that started the mission on Guam, and they were very male focused. They're a much more masculine sort of, within the priestly sex, you have different types. They each have sort of a different tone and attitude. And so they put forth the head of their order as being the one for the capital of the island, the first capital in the Pacific, by the way. But Chamorros never really got behind that. But once the church started to put out Santa Maria, and that's why we see on island different versions of Mary, different female sort of figures. Once they did that, Chamorro women in particular became more open to the church. Open not in just a public sense, but open in their hearts too, more willing to accept it because they see that this connects to what I believe in. I believe in the matrilineal Magahaga figure, that women are not supposed to be shut away, that sort of there has to be the strong female force in society. There's power to that. That's the way things are supposed to be. And when the church, at least in superficial ways, or you could say in deeper ways, starts to put that out there, more and more Chamorros are accepting. So this is interesting because it keeps this distinct identity. Chamorros don't become Filipinos. Chamorros don't become Mexicans. They don't feel that they are Spanish from Spain. They develop they keep their own unique sense of identity. But the fact of the matter is that these ideas of cultural loss, genocide, sort of disappearance, extinction, all of these types of things which often follow indigenous people in the modern world, these are all reasons why historians choose to not look at this time or see this time as just one of decay, a time when Chamorros are starting to disappear from the world. And so the third person that we're going to be talking about in this list of 10 figures is Jose De Salas, or Jose Salas, because in a sense he represents that Chamorro continuity and that Chamorro sense of identity. At a time when historians discount it left and right, we are finally starting to see, as more and more Spanish documents are translated and more people take a look at that time, we're now seeing that it was not a time when nothing was happening except Chamorros were disappearing. It was actually a time when lots of things were happening. A lot of crazy things were happening. And it was also a time when Chamorros were beginning to understand themselves again in a critical way. So in the Chamorro-Spanish Wars, Chamorros fought against the Spanish with their slingstones and their spears. But what we see with Jose Salas and with others in the 19th century is that Chamorros were starting to develop a critical sense, a critique of the Spanish control over their islands. And many of them put it into words, some of them put it into deeds. And Jose De Salas is an example of somebody who put it into violent deeds. So in terms of the 18th century, you see this image? This is actually probably the earliest photograph taken in the Marianas Islands. And so this is the village of Hagatna. And so life in the 18th century in Guam and in the Marianas. By the start of the 18th century, Chamorros only live in Guam and in Rota. They had not yet been allowed to return to Saipan. Life was dictated largely by the ringing of church bells. Chamorros were citizens within the Spanish Empire. They had some rights within the Spanish Empire. They did not elect any local leaders, and much of the government was filled with people from elsewhere in the Spanish Empire. As was always as was always true in colonial sort of overseas apparatus, those at the top were always from Spain, peninsulares, people from the peninsula. Whereas as you moved down in the government, you could find people who were from the colonies of Spain. But at the top, it was pretty much usually always somebody who was from Spain itself. So the identity of people at that time, Hispanic in some ways in style, for example. Cockfighting was supremely important to men on the island. To a lot of women on the island, cockfighting was evil and terrible, and it was the reason, and it was tied to a lot of things like alcoholism, spousal abuse, loss of whatever little money they had. But Chamorros, Spanish governors would talk about Chamorros as being docile. American governors would do the same thing, that they were ignorant of the world, that they were lazy, that they could care less about what was going on. But that's not true. In the 19th century, the 1800s, the Spanish Empire underwent huge revolutionary changes. By the start of the 1800s, Spain lost almost all of its colonies overseas as wars against Spain, fighting for independence, erupted in Latin America. And in fact, in the 1820s, one of the last ships carrying Spanish officials leaving Latin America after all of the revolutions there had been successful in establishing new independent countries, it stops in Guam. It stops in Guam, and the ship, which is filled with men from Peru, men from Peru, soldiers from Peru, but Spanish officers, Spanish officials, it stops in Umatic, because the only places left in the Spanish Empire are the Philippines, Micronesia, Cuba, Puerto Rico islands in the Caribbean. But when this ship arrives in Guam, the men from Peru kick out all of the Spaniards, and they put them in a boat and they send them ashore, and then they sail back to Latin America to join the new countries that have started there. And so as the 19th century is a time when the Spanish Empire is going through all sorts of revolutionary changes, and these changes impact Guam. In the 1800s, what we see is that Guam is not quote unquote cut off from the world, but in fact, as Spain is trying to figure out what to do, as there's more and more pushes for reform to sort of develop more democratic powers for people, more democratic rights, to decrease the power of the monarchy, even some pushes which say that the people in the Spanish territory should be given their independence, Spain cracks down. And so Guam becomes, for several decades in the 1800s, a prison colony, a penal colony. So this is the Tribunat, which was in the village of Hagåtña. And the Tribunat was one of those places where Spanish political prisoners were often kept. And so when we talk about Spanish political prisoners, and when we talk about prisoners in general, Guam was home to a lot of different types of prisoners. So one, there was these deportados, as they were called. These were often sort of people that came from high-class Spanish families who were reformists, who wanted to change Spanish society, make it more liberal, make it more open, make the government more accountable. And they might be arrested, but because they came from good backgrounds, because they were reformists, they wouldn't be executed, but they would be punished by being sent to Guam. And so these deportados, these types of prisoners, were very interesting, because while they could be on Guam for several years, they would interact with Chamorros, and they would talk to Chamorros. They would make friends amongst Chamorros, especially those Chamorros who came from the mestizo families, the Chamorros who had enough Spanish blood in them, who had big houses in Hagåtña. They might have parties with them. They might have their merienda with them. They might talk about philosophy. They might introduce these Chamorros to new ideas that were going on in Europe. Chamorros tended to like these deportados because they didn't come in huge numbers, and they didn't necessarily do much because they were just biding. They didn't cause any problems on the island because they were just biding their time until there could be until reparations could be made, until there could be a change in government and they could be allowed to return home. Interestingly enough, some of these deportados would try to find ways to sneak off the island, trying to find people who would hide them in their ships so they could leave. And so it depended. For the Spanish political prisoners, a lot of them were allowed to roam freely. They rented houses from Chamorro families because they were high-class prisoners, you know, country club. Guam was like their distant country club prison. So, but these are the Peninsulari. These are from Spain. Now, another class of prisoner comes to Guam, and this is a type that Chamorros do not like. These are confinados, convicts. And so the Philippines was basically the center of the Spanish Empire in Asia, the seat of the viceroy. And it was, while Spain had the Manila Acapulco galleon trade, the Philippines was essential in getting access to Chinese and Oriental markets. And so the Philippines, like any colony, you know, like any big colony, which is made up of thousands of islands and dozens of different people, it had lots of prisoners. And so as prisons would grow overwhelmed and overflow with prisoners, every once in a while, the government in the Philippines would send sometimes dozens, sometimes hundreds of them to Guam. And they would be kept. And so this is over several decades. These types of prisoners would sometimes be kept in places where they would, be restrained, confined. But sometimes there simply wasn't enough room. Confinados, convicts. There wasn't enough room. There wasn't enough facilities to house all of these prisoners. And the Spanish government really could care less about these prisoners. And so something that might happen is that as they send 100 of them on a ship to Guam, they might not give them food on the weeks that they're sailing to Guam. And some of them might die, and they might get diseased and sick, and then they might just dump them on Guam. This was especially true for Chinese prisoners, because Chinese in the Philippines at that time were confined to certain areas. There was a lot of animosity from the Spanish and from Filipinos towards Chinese. And so confinados were often tied to social problems in Guam. There was, for example, on one occasion when these convicts, when one governor, wanting to use them for manual labor, decided to make it so that Chamorro families would be assigned a convict who would stay with them and then would farm for them to help them. Eventually, though, it was revealed that a number of these convicts had been meeting secretly and that they had been plotting to overthrow the Spanish government on the island and murder the families that they were working with. And it was only, and they were only caught because the Spanish suspected one of the convicts, and they interrogated him, and he revealed the plan and showed the secret location in the jungle where they were meeting to plan this, and they were able to capture them. And so these convicts sometimes would form gangs on the island. Sometimes they would fight with Chamorros. So for example, violence would commonly break out at cockfights, because these convicts would sometimes would have very strong identities in opposition to the island. They would hate being on the island. They would hate the Spanish. They would hate Chamorros. And so it was common for people to have knives, for example, as they went to cockfights. And so you might have stabbings or slashings when somebody accused somebody else of cheating. And this was especially true if it might be a Filipino versus a Chamorro in a cockfight. Then you might see the lines racially divided at the Gazera, and that might lead to tensions, and it might lead to fights and riots breaking out. And so there were, you can see some of the impact of these convicts still exist up until today. So for example, if you drive from Pago Bay to Hagatna, the road that you drive on was paved for the first time by convicts from the Philippines. If you go behind the Hagatna shopping center to where there's the Hagatna swamp or Hagatna Springs, you'll see the remnants of dikes, because the Spanish governor at one time had tried to drain the swamp back there. Oh my goodness, that reminds me of Donald Trump. Tried to drain the swamp back there so that people could farm back there. And so they had squads of Filipino convicts and Chinese convicts working back there. They had built up a whole bunch of walls to try to dam and keep the water out. But no matter how much they put, the water would keep coming back. And so if you go back there, you can see the dikes and the dams that they built. The walls are still there, oftentimes almost completely flooded over. And so these types of convicts made Chamorros. So when you look at these two, you can see that one type of political prisoner is encouraging Chamorros to think about more than what they have right now. And the other type of political prisoner, or the other type of prisoner, shows Chamorros in a way their value within the Spanish Empire, that they don't have a very high value, and that they're not being treated very well, that their island is a dumping ground for sort of death row inmates that Manila doesn't want to deal with anymore. And so all of these sort of critiques become even stronger once the Philippines itself starts to engage in revolutionary activities, where you have different mutinies and you have different people organizing rebellions. And once that happens, then you get the irresponsables. Then you get a new type of prisoner that gets sent to Guam, and these are Filipino political prisoners. And they get sent every time there's uprisings, such as the Cavite Mutiny, the revolutions that start out in the 1890s. In order to try to quell them, the Spanish try to capture people, and they try to get them out of the Philippines and send them to Guam, where they can't do anything to aid in further rebellious activities. And so these prisoners are interesting. So a few of the Spanish deportados stay in the Marianas, but more of these Filipino political prisoners decide to stay in the Marianas and marry Chamorro women and start families. Now, the most famous of these political prisoners, however, does not decide to stay. But you may have heard of Apollinario Mabini, one of the leaders of sort of the Filipino Revolution. And there are 2 statues to Mabini, 3 if you count the one that got destroyed by a typhoon. There are 3 statues to Mabini in the village of Asin, because that's where he stayed. And he wrote in his autobiography about his time on Guam, sort of, about the people. He met regularly with Chamorros, talked to them about stuff, hung out with them. But so once this starts happening, then it's really clear to some Chamorros that the world is changing. And the 1800s, we see this more and more in terms of Chamorros, at least on the record, in documentation, sort of asserting themselves in certain ways, asserting that they're not being treated fairly by the Spanish, asserting that they would like more, and finding ways to fight back against those that are mistreating them. So the most notorious of all of the Spanish officials who Chamorros didn't like would be the governor, because the governor had incredible power on the island. And the Spanish governors, now not all Spanish governors, some Spanish governors were noted for trying to help the people, right? Like they talk about in the 1700s, they talk about the good governor Tobias who wanted to elevate the economy of the island, imported deer from the Philippines, for example. But a lot of the Spanish governors in their time on Guam would only use their presence here to make themselves money. So one of the things that the Spanish governors would do is that they would condemn land belonging to Chamorros, and then they would sell it. So sell it to themselves, and then they would sell it. They would also control who could have businesses on Guam. So the Spanish governors would open a store, and every time a new shipment of things came in, they would open up their store and they could dictate whatever prices they wanted. And so even from their own employees or their own soldiers, they would extort money from them by basically jacking up and gouging them for prices. And so the Spanish governors, because no one really cared about Guam in the Spanish Empire, they could arrest Chamorros for any reason, even if it was illegal or unlawful for them to do it. They could punish Chamorros for any reason. And so we see in the 1800s, some Chamorros finally try to speak out publicly and organize against this. Now, for most Chamorros, they put their resistance into stories. They would never feel that they could go against the Spanish government, go against the Spanish governor. And so the stories of Juan Mala are one example of how Chamorros would express their frustration by creating a folk hero who was always making the Spanish look stupid. And so it was making the Spanish look silly. And when we look at the stories of Juan Mala, they're very interesting because a lot of them focus on how, Chamorros just want to live their lives. They want to sort of enjoy life. They believe in certain things, and the Spanish think that they're better because they have money, because they wear fancy clothes, because they have horses. And so Juan Mala oftentimes targets the Spanish and gets them to give up those things that the Spanish assert make them better. So if a Spaniard loves money more than anything else, Juan Mala finds a way to trick the Spaniard into giving up the money by taking advantage of his greed. If the Spanish governor sort of looks down on Chamorros from his high horse, his literal high horse, then Juan finds a way to get the governor to give up his horse to make him look stupid. And there's even a story in which Juan finds a way to convince the Spanish governor to allow him to sleep with his 3 virgin daughters. And so they don't teach that one in GDOE though. And so for a lot of Chamorros, not feeling that they were empowered in any way, because only by the end of the Spanish era are Chamorros actually allowed to even elect their local leaders, elect like mayors, only at the very end. And locals were allowed to work in the Spanish government, but one of the main things is you had to speak Spanish, and most Chamorros couldn't necessarily speak fluent Spanish. Even as the language changed and accepted more Spanish, they weren't necessarily functionally or highly fluent in Spanish. And so, but there were some, in addition to just telling stories, there are Chamorros that found other ways to resist or other ways to protest. And so the most famous is Jose Salas. But another person who is often taught about alongside Jose Salas is Luis Baza. Luis Baza worked with others to organize a class action lawsuit, a joint complaint against the Spanish governor of their time, who was abusing his power in terrible ways. The Spanish governor demanded that all of these people dismiss and withdraw their lawsuit against him, their complaint against him, and he threatened to demolish their houses. He threatened to flog them if they did not sort of obey him, and pretty much everyone else withdrew and stepped back, not wanting to be punished, but Luis Baza stayed with it. And for that, he was publicly flogged. And then he was deported to Roda, to Luta. And he was forced to stay there for several years. Now, eventually, the interesting thing about Luis Baza is that eventually he won. His complaint made its way through the administrative sort of justice system within the Spanish Empire, and the governor was found to be in the wrong, and he was removed from Guam, and he was ordered never to set foot on the island of Guam again. There's a story of a Spanish official who was so loathed by the Chamorro people, and actually so loathed by the governor himself, because he was racist, because he would speak openly and contemptuously about the local people, about the indios, as they called Chamorros. He was so bad that eventually the Spanish governor forced him to live in Umatic so he wouldn't have to deal with him. But the people in Umatic hated him so much that, and it's hard to figure out what exactly happened, because we just have sort of his letters and other accounts. But he began to have nightmares that Chamorros were trying to kill him. And eventually, it's mentioned that Chamorros actually did try to kill him by poisoning his food. And so it makes you wonder what other sort of simple acts of resistance might have happened like that to sort of offensive and sort of terrible characters in the Spanish government. And so Jose Salas, though, and I wish that we knew more about Jose Salas. Carlos Madrid is a historian who wants to sort of publish more about Jose Salas because he is from Spain. He wrote a book several years ago published by the Northern Marianas Humanities Council, Beyond Distances, which is a very good book that talks about a lot of the things that I've talked about today. And so when he publishes more on Jose Salas, then we will know more about it. But so one of the main ways that Chamorros could work for the Spanish government was in the militia. There was a Chamorro militia. And so in 1884, the Spanish governor in the afternoon in April was sort of returning home from attending church. He was returning home to the Palacio, to the governor's palace in Hagåtña. And he passed, as he walked into the Palacio, one of the sentries, a young Chamorro guy named Jose De Salas, shot him in the back, killing him. And sort of the Spanish officers and the military immediately rounded up all of the sort of the Spanish soldiers. They disarmed all of the Chamorros that were in the militia, and then they hunted for Jose Salas. Eventually, the next morning, Jose Salas turned himself in. And there's differing accounts of why Jose Salas did that. And so one account is that it was a personal disagreement, that Jose Salas harbored resentment towards the Spanish governor and the Spanish government, and he did this just out of his personal vindictiveness. But as they interviewed the other members of the militia, the other account says that Jose Salas was part of a conspiracy, that the Chamorro men in the militia had been talking and had been meeting and had been planning to overthrow the Spanish government on the island. And that Jose de Salas was to fire the first shot, killing the Spanish governor. But other members of the militia were to carry out their own orders, targeting other officials. And so now, some of the accounts at that time argue that the Spanish government tried to play up the threat. Although, given what I've known sort of about oral history at that time, you could definitely find that a lot of times Chamorros did talk about sort of what things would be like if the oppressive government sort of wasn't sort of constraining the island the way it was, or if they were rid of all of these corrupt officials, which are always sort of keeping the island in their iron grip. And so I would lean towards the fact that there was a conspiracy. Now, it may have been a conspiracy in which there was a few guys who were just there because they were following or because they were interested, right? But that there was probably some, like Jose Salas, who strongly believed. And what's important about all of these, and so eventually 46, I believe, and I may be a little bit wrong in that number, but I think it was 46 of the militia were taken to the Philippines to be put on trial. Some of them were acquitted. One of them died while he was in prison in the Philippines during the trial. Several dozen were put in prison in the Philippines, and 4 of them were brought back to Guam and were executed. Where did I put that? I need to spend some, hold on. And so the names of the 4 that were executed, let me see if I can remember them off the top of my head. I remember their last names. There was an Acosta, there was a Mingiola, there was an Ugan. Hold on, I have it in the dispensa. And so if you ever want to visit the area where they were executed, because these, Hungan, I got their names right, Biba. And so, hold on one second. Jose Salas, Manuel Mingiola, Vicente Acosta, and Manuel Ugan. These were the 4 that were convicted. These were the 4 that were sort of convicted of leading the conspiracy. So these may have been the 4 that were resolute, and strongly believed in sort of getting rid of the Spanish and establishing a government for Chamorros and for Guam. But so these four were brought back to Guam, and they were executed by firing squad on the beach. And so if you are, if you're familiar with Guam, outside of Hagåtña, in where they call East Hagåtña, there's the old city bank. It's now something else. There's a Shell station there, and there's also a Burger King, and there's a pizza place called Crust. Across from that area, on the beach, is the location where the four men were supposed to have been executed. So along the Tinsera there. And so now, what all of this points to, though, is not the disappearance of the Chamorro, but rather that what we see with Jose De Salas, Luis Baza, and others at this time is we see the emergence of the Chamorro in a modern context. That the Chamorro, in a sense, was reborn, not as a footnote necessarily to the Spanish Empire, not as sort of some sort of just mestizo mutt, but that what we see at that time is that there are the stirrings of nationalism in Chamorros at that time. That by talking to those in Spain by talking to Spanish political prisoners who strongly believed that their government should be different, by meeting with those from the Philippines who believed that they should have the right to govern themselves, we can see that these conversations and these ideas absolutely influenced Chamorros too. And so, one historian argues, and Robert Underwood as well argues, that this was a natural progression, that around the Spanish Empire, as their remaining colonies sort of endured the oppressiveness and the indifference of Spanish rule in the twilight of its empire, that these nationalist movements and these movements for independence sprung out because of the people wanting more, feeling like the world was moving ahead and they were stuck and they were trapped and that they deserved more. And that Guam is included in that. Oftentimes historians point to the Philippines, to Puerto Rico, and to Cuba, where you have strong nationalist movements and revolutionary movements. But what we see in the example of Jose De Salas and others is that Chamorros also had those same drives, the same feelings that they should be allowed a minimum amount of dignity. They should be allowed to have a say in what happens in their own land. And so one of the fascinating things, because when more of this research started to come out, one thing that Robert Underwood argued, and I agree with him, and Carlos Madrid as well sort of also agrees, that if the United States had not taken Guam when it did in 1898, it's very likely that eventually Spain would have given Guam its independence, and that Guam would have transitioned into being independent without a lot of great difficulty necessarily. There were some families who were strongly tied to the Spanish, and their sense of worth and their sense of status was tied to the Spanish. Those are the families which left to go to Spain. The Chamorro families, the mestizo families that went to Spain or left the island after the US took it. But there was enough of the seeds of nationalism that eventually, if the US hadn't come in and taken Guam, Guam probably would be an independent country right now. It would have progressed because all of the feelings, all of the elements for it were in place at that time. What happened was that historians ignored them for quite a while, choosing instead to rely on tired and particularly useless narratives about just Chamorros being docile, Chamorros not caring about anything, just being sort of people who had no ambition or desire for change, as one Navy governor described the Chamorro people. The Spanish families? Oh, well, so I mean, one of them is, some of those Chamorro families still have some contact, like the Ada. There's Adas. They keep contact with their family, and so the Artero didn't. So the Artero is a little bit different because the Artero, Pascual Artero, came after the U.S. Came to Guam after the U.S. had already taken over. But you do have some, I'm trying to remember, I remember a few years ago, one of those families contacted me. I can't remember what their Chamorro name is, so. But yeah, because for a lot of those families, the funny thing is that they believe that the United States was less civilized than the Spanish. And so they didn't like the idea of America coming in because America was this rascally, rambunctious young country, whereas Spain was venerable and civilized and dignified. So that's why a lot of those families first went to Saipan, because Saipan was still controlled by Spain for a while. And then some of them went back to Spain. And so, what's sad though, and one of the reasons why I talk about these things and why I teach these things is because it is easy for us to continually be steamrolled by these strong narratives of history that feel very natural, but simply aren't true and don't benefit us in any way. It's very easy for Chamorros to feel that they did stop existing at that time, or that we're not connected to our ancient ancestors. But but we learn this history though, so we can fill in the gaps, so we can see the connections, so we can see that our history is not one before colonization and then one after colonization, but that it is our history through colonization. It is our history towards decolonization. It's still our history, and that we need not accept the divisions that historians, anthropologists, missionaries, colonizers, that they made for us. And understanding our history in its intricacies, understanding our history even if we may not even agree with some of the things. Like we may not agree that Jose De Salas was right in resorting to violence in his attempt to assert the rights of his people to determine things in their own land. But what we need to do is connect those things to ourselves today, because in the same way in which we look to the heroes, who are the heroes that we look to in our past? And are the heroes that we look to, are they even really heroes that have any connection to us, right? And so we learn our history, we know these stories so that we can honor our own heroes, and that we can connect those, we can fill in those gaps, we can connect those dots, and that we can understand that we have always been fighting, we've always been resisting, that we've always been wanting something better, that even the desire for decolonization today is not something new. The way that we talk about the struggle for sovereignty, for basic dignity, to be treated with dignity, to have the ability to dictate things in your own lands. Chamorros have always felt those things. We just need to understand. We just need to understand that. So then, for example, if you encounter somebody who says that, oh no, Chamorros don't protest, that's not in line with our culture, you can say, well, a Chamorro who's older than you shot a Spanish governor. I mean, he's like super Manamku. If you're Manamku, he's like super Manamku. He died in 1885. I mean, you're saying he wasn't Chamorro? No, that's not the Chamorro way. So it's important to learn these things so that when people push back and say that the purpose of the Chamorro is to simply go with the flow, you can say no. Chamorros were great navigators. Chamorros were passionate rebels. Chamorros were freedom fighters. Chamorros were not just those who served others. Chamorros were not just those who stayed quiet. Chamorros were also those who fought back. And so it's important to know that history, so that we don't have to rely on other people's histories to make our argument right. We don't only have to look to others for our heroes, for our examples. Some of them, yeah. Oh yeah, you can definitely see lots of those. But yes, so that is it for me. That is it for my presentation. Sidus Masi. Are there any questions? Bernard Punsalan has a lot of them online. where you can see them. But almost all of them are in the Micronesia Area Research Center. But Chamorro Roots Genealogy has a lot of those. And so, are there any questions? I wish that I could tell you more about Jose Salas, but we do. It's interesting because more and more we make like connections, like even to that time. So, for example, recently I learned that one of the Chamorros that was taken to the Philippines as part of that attempted revolt, he was an Estaque, and he died in prison while he was on trial. And he left with him 2 children in Guam, one of whom is the father of George Estaque, who's still alive. And he lives on the East Coast. And he was the former chief of staff to Tony Wampat when he was in Congress. And so understanding that this is not sort of ancient history, or that even somebody like Luis Baza, another Chamorro who lives in Washington D.C. is Tony Baza. And so Tony Baza sort of, when he was young, he remembered that in his family, they never used the belt to punish children. It was something in their family. They never ever used it. And in fact, many of his older family members didn't wear belts. And he didn't understand why until after he learned about the account of his ancestor, Luis Baza, and how because of the family that had watched their relative be flogged publicly and whipped publicly, because of that trauma, the family had stopped wearing belts and didn't use them, even though it was such a common thing to punish children by whipping them. Or, I mean, not whipping, I guess whipping. Some depended on who's your nana, right? Or who's your tata, right? Some of you may have gotten the capital punishment style. But so it's interesting. So we make these connections, but we have to ask and we have to look. And for the longest time, Chamorros felt like the past is the past. We can't do anything about it. And so, but you never know what you're going to find. You never know what you're going to find. And that's when we treat our history like it's real and like it's ours and it's valuable, is when we don't just leave it up to others to tell us about it, or we don't just say it's gone in the past, but when you really look into it, when you really think about it, you'll find all of these interesting connections. And so even in just recent years, we found some random connections to those men who tried to revolt against the Spanish. And that some of their children later talked about or became men who talked about the Americans as oppressing them before World War II, and became part of those who protested American treatment of Chamorros before World War II. But the problem is that the stories were never passed on, really, and there was no public place for people to put those stories. So it just feels like this is, this is just our family history. It doesn't belong to anything bigger, right? But no, these were stories of Chamorros who believed strongly in something before a lot of people were talking about it. So, but anyways, so, question.
So, Senor, yes, Hungan. I'm asking you to kind of generalize, because I do feel like you have answered the question, but and I actually meant to ask you this the last 2 times as well. Can you give like kind of a quick a synopsis of why, of the 10 Chamorro figures that you've chosen? Why was it? What is the pivotal or the most impactful reason that you chose Jose De Salas?
Oh,
which I kind of feel like you've already answered the question,
okay.
But I'm just curious, from in a more concise manner, what would be the reason that you feel like you chose him? And if you wanted to just recap real quick on the last 2 as well, on why you chose Fauna and Agbalin.
And so each of them sort of gives us, a sense of a time, or gives us a sense of I guess you could call a narrative or a tendency, or I don't even know what the right word, but something that persists in the history or in the culture. So Fa'una is about understanding a framework for Chamorro culture, the matrilineal framework for it. But it's also then about establishing that as being like a strong way that Chamorros understood the world, and then it has persisted even through time, even after colonization has tried to sort of diminish it. But establishing that as the foundation, Fa'una is important just to get your groundings, right? Your bearings. You know, that when indigenous people meet, sometimes they tell their creation stories to each other. They tell their story to each other to establish that these are the things that we value. And so you should always start with a creation story. If I had started with Magellan or something like that, then it would give off sort of the wrong idea about what we should be valuing or focusing on. For Aguilin, it was trying to sort of talk about the Chamorro-Spanish Wars, not as something being, because for me, I always feel that one of the things that we should highlight from our past is that Chamorros strongly believed in intellect and creativity. But if we look at where the culture is nowadays, there's a stronger emphasis on physicality and service and conformity. So it's not sort of that and then we have, this doesn't mean that Chamorros don't have articulate or creative people. But when you look at the larger tendencies in the culture, there tends to be a focus on sort of just pushing people into sort of pushing them to be cogs in a machine, where there's less of an emphasis. And that's why it's and I think that for Aguilin, I wanted to show somebody who was active, who fought, but also who was beloved and notorious for his intellect, not necessarily his physical fighting prowess. And to show that, and because sometimes when we look to the ancient past, there's the masculinity creep, where sort of you look at it as sort of all of these strong, powerful men who fought because of the depictions of them as being huge, muscled dudes, right? But no, from everything we know, Chamorros believed in physical strength, sure, but that a man was stronger the better he could speak and the more he could remember, not how much he could lift. And so for me, I always want to push that back into the culture, that we should embrace that part of ourselves, because we can see we can see it in our educational system. The educational system on Guam is primarily focused, sadly, especially at the high school level, with kind of just pushing kids to join the military. You give them sort of basic skills, but there's a strong push just that, let them be the military's issue. There's less of an emphasis on giving them empowering sort of skills to much less emphasis. But what we see is that every time there's programs to bring out that creativity, they do fantastic. They do wonderful things. But there's still always just this push that we are made from a more common substance. And those are the remnants, the dregs of sort of how colonialism gets in the flesh and in the mind, is just that you don't think very much of yourself. And so that you think that you're really kind of supposed to just serve somebody else or do what somebody else says. And I'm always for pushing the idea that we are smart. That Harel says that we are stronger than we think. I like to push the idea that we're smarter than we think. And so many people in our families, imagine if we all have people that are incredibly articulate, that are great storytellers. But what happens though is that they become great storytellers in the cocina en San Hizong, in the back kitchen. They become great storytellers on WhatsApp. They become great storytellers when the power goes out after a typhoon. And that's beautiful and that's nice. But they exist in a society which doesn't nurture that creativity. It doesn't sort of use it for anything bigger. It doesn't channel it, not the way that our ancient society took those people, and it found that if a child was particularly intelligent, then the child would be trained to know the knowledge, to know the lore of the clan, and to represent the clan in debates and represent the clan in song. And so you think about that. So when I talk about Aguilin, it's interesting because I picked somebody who was fighting the Spanish, but I also love Aguilin because all the Spanish indicate that he was brilliant. And that's in a way what scared them, was that they couldn't reduce him to the brute, which was what they did with so many others, but that he seemed to have tactics, he seemed to be better organized. And so for me, I always want to remind ourselves of that, even today, that we're not just stronger than we think, we're smarter than we think. But for me, it's not just about talking about it, it's about creating the infrastructure so that those values are supported, those skills are supported. So that's one of the problems that we face, right? Is that, and usually around this type of year, there's the Guam International Film Festival on, and I think it's still happening, but it's going to be online. And so all of you can probably tune in and support. But that's one of those things, is that the Muña brothers started more than a decade ago, sort of this renaissance of Chamorro film by making their own film, Shiro's Head. And we see now that Netflix is putting out Operation Christmas Drop, and Netflix is promoting it as the first movie ever made on Guam, which is not true. There's been lots of movies made on Guam. There's 2 quote unquote Hollywood movies that have been made on Guam. And then there's a lot of local films that have been made on Guam. But we see even people here on Guam and Chamorros celebrating this like it is the first thing we get put on the map. Biba. Netflix is putting us on the map. All right. And so that's a problem. If you don't even know what your own people have done, ooh, that's really bad. If somebody comes along and tells you, hey, we discovered you. It's like Magellan 5.0, because we're 500 years later. It's Magellan 5.0. And so what's been sad about that is that when the Muña brothers released Shiro's Head, it led to this opening where all of these people that had been thinking about pushing their creativity in that way, they wanted to start making films. And so you have all of these people then, and so the Guam International Film Festival was supported by all of these local films, small, like short films that people wanted to make. The problem was that the talent and the drive, the desire to tell the stories were there, but the government wouldn't support it, the business community wouldn't support it, and ultimately, even the culture wasn't necessarily strongly supportive of it either. Because as I talked about, for those of you who are in my values class, one of the things that happens with Chamorros is that our sense of national identity, our sense of ethnic identity is very porous. So it is super strong about maybe something like food. It is super potent about a sticker on your car. But when it comes to something like somebody has made a film to represent Guam, you are more likely to see that film in relation to an Avengers movie or Game of Thrones, because you feel that those are the things. And so what happens for a lot of these films is that people say, oh, it looks bad, it doesn't look as good as Game of Thrones, or it's not as good as this and that. And that's part of our porous national identity, is that it's strong in certain ways, but then for the things that sort of fill your life, like media, it's weak, because Chamorros have kind of accepted that we don't do certain things. We don't really create art. We make music. That's different. But in general, we don't see ourselves as being those creative intellectual forces. But we have so many Chamorros that do those things. But if the culture doesn't shift, and if the government and society doesn't shift, then they make things, they do stuff, but it won't ever sort of reach the level that it needs to. And so that's why, I feel bad, because if people had, instead of sort of looking at Shiro's Head and saying, oh, it's not as good as this, it's not as good as a Scorsese movie or something like that. If if people had stopped with that and instead sort of said that this is a chance for us to really support local, sort of tell our own stories, you know, we could be at a point right now where Guam and Chamorros would be making things for Netflix. We would be making our own things for Netflix, because that's one of the, when we talk about a knowledge economy, we talk about science a lot of times, science and patents, but knowledge economy is also creating the media that travels, even if pandemics shut down borders, right? And so Guam and Chamorros could absolutely do that, but you have to have that stronger sense of your consciousness in order to sort of get behind that, or else you're always going to feel like whatever you make isn't, like, this isn't really what we do. So I'm sure you guys may see that. If it's sort of, if somebody makes like, if somebody's cooking Chamorro food, it's like, yeah. So if you're on Facebook, you may see it. If somebody posts like a picture of Chamorro food, everyone likes it. But if somebody says, hey, I've written a Chamorro book, very few people will like it, and very few people will care about it. If somebody kind of posts a picture of like a Chamorro, like making a joke or something, and it's just kind of funny and silly, people will like it. But if somebody actually tries to make a movie to represent Chamorro things, people won't necessarily like it. And that's part of that disconnect. And anyways, you asked about Aguilin, and I went off on a tangent about sort of, but it is part of the whole intellectual thrust, is that for me, I see that in some ways colonization, like if you think about the fullness of potential identity for a Chamorro person, colonization makes it seem like parts of that fullness are gone. They're lost, or they're inaccessible. So you learn the history and you talk about values, so you can try to remind people that no, your identity is not sort of this weird distorted shape. You can have this fullness of your identity. It's not that in order to do this, you can't be Chamorro, or you have to be less Chamorro, right? No, Chamorros. And so sometimes people feel those things, but for me, we want to learn history so that we can have a fuller sense of who we are. Because if you have a fuller sense of who you are, you tend to have a stronger feeling about sort of your community. Because then if somebody sort of, then you're able to navigate and negotiate things from a stronger sense of place. There's less of a feeling that you have to give up things that are important to you in order to negotiate or navigate, like the problems in life, right? That's the stronger sense of self and the stronger sense of grounding and rootedness that you have, the more likely you are to resist attempts to change your culture, or to make you give up your land, or to sell things off, because those things ground you. They aren't things to let go of because the modern world doesn't take them seriously or thinks they're worthless. They're things that you should hold on to because they're precious. Anyways, dispensadzo. That was but yeah, so a lot of times, and so, yeah, so that's how sort of I pick some of these people, is that I want to fill in some of the gaps in history. I want us to understand some of the narratives and the drives in Chamorro history. And I also want us to look at models, people sort of who represent sort of models that went against the grain of the time, but models that we should definitely look up to. And so.
No, I appreciate that. I have to, tell you that when Travis, approached me after you guys had kind of had this discussion, that this was the direction we wanted to go, and I was excited because I knew that you would be choosing to present figures that are not more, commonly known, but even more so, why is it that you feel like these are people that are important for us to know? The perspective that we are able to kind of look at things and understand that these people may not have been, taught to us in a kind of a more popular sense, but they are still so important and so valuable for us to learn about, to have a greater sense and understanding of the culture as a whole. So I appreciate that. Every week as we learn about a new person, I'm interested in your perspective of why is this person important for us to know about.
No, todus masi. And so, no, thank you all for listening. And if you have any older relatives, we're coming upon like some of our last chances to try to get oral history from the Spanish period. So there's no one alive today who was alive during the Spanish period on Guam. There's no Chamorros that are left. But if you have older relatives who had contact with their oldest relatives at that time, talk to them about it, ask them about it, because sometimes they'll remember stories and it'll just be that they thought that no one wanted to talk about this, or that it didn't matter. Sometimes people will have knowledge like that if it's tied to like their family name or their family history, right? So when they say, people, why do you have this family name? Oh, because this Spanish guy came in at this time and blah blah blah. And so if you have any older relatives, ask them about the Spanish period, because sometimes people find really fascinating details that they didn't know before, but they it's one student, when I was teaching at UOG, he interviewed his dad, who said that his grandmother said that her father was the one in the village of Agate who would light the coconut oil lamps, so that he would go around during the Spanish period, before there was electricity, and there was lamps in different places in the village, and that it was his job to go around with coconut oil, fill up the lamps, and then also set them on fire at a certain time. And it's like, and so you may find those sorts of little fascinating details. But the point though is that it's our history. We want to fill it with life. And it's exciting when I get so excited when people tell me even just small details like that, because when you read the history books, it just feels like this huge stretch of time, and there's nothing really important. The important things are when explorers visit the island, or when Spanish governors come in, but nothing about the people of the land. So, todus masi. And so I'm excited for next week. I have a couple of different options for the fourth figure, but I'm gonna try to have a PowerPoint ready so that you don't just have to stare at me while I talk. But todus masi no todos hamyo. Adios. Hasta aquí otra semana. Hasta aquí mina'tulu. Until next week.
Adios. Todus masi.